Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. Government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Greetings. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mitch Wander on behalf of Joint Special Operations University, Office of Strategic Engagement. Welcome to a very timely discussion with Dr. Daniel Moore. Just 5 months ago, he released his book, Offensive Cyber Operations, Understanding Intangible Warfare. We'll take a deep dive into his observations regarding nation-state cyber warfare. Along the way, we'll look at his take on why it's critical to define terms such as cyber warfare and intangible warfare, even before looking at what nations have been doing with offensive cyber operations. Definitions matter. As for me, I've been an instructor at JSOU for several years, currently in the Department of Strategic Intelligence and Emerging Technologies. I joined JSOU in my Army Reserve role to help develop our first cyber course, and now we offer multiple courses on cyber topics. I've been part of the instructor team for the Cyberspace and Special Operations course since its founding. The course is anything but static, as we take what we learn from our students and the greater special operations community to refine our course over time. While we look at cyber from SOF's perspective, we focus on enabling cyber planners to expand their range of options for the commander. We work through a lot of tough questions and leave students with a variety of approaches to consider after they leave the course. Our work related to cyberspace remains a top priority for SOCOM leadership. During the hearings for confirmation as SOCOM commander last year, General Fenton mentioned cyber a few times. When asked about how nation-state adversaries were using asymmetric means to conduct operations that fall below the threshold of armed conflict, General Fenton cited Iranian cyber activities as one example of these gray zone activities. He also asked if there are additional military capabilities that should be developed by the Department of Defense to compete more effectively in the information environment. General Fenton responded, "I believe the nexus between soft, space, and cyber capabilities offers new possibilities for strategic competition and integrated deterrence. And if confirmed, I look forward to exploring this concept for use by special operations forces in the information environment and other domains." Clearly, we have a lot of work to do as a command. Expanding our operation of cyber issues plays a critical part. That brings us to Dr. Moore, our distinguished guest today, who has several years examined offensive cyber operations. His research looks across doctrine, public statements, known cyber operations, and foreign affairs environment in which all of this has occurred. What's the value of assessing such a broad range of activities? Dr. Moore enables us to separate an abundance of activities that happen in cyberspace from those actions that constitute military-aligned offensive cyber operations. For political and military leadership focused on situations that relate to actual or potential military conflict, his framework provides an innovative means to identify the latter. This in turn gives him the ability to analyze major nation-states' offensive cyber operations to derive a clear understanding of how each nation approaches military-aligned offensive cyber operations. Welcome, Dr. Moore.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with the story behind your book. Your research originally came from your Ph.D. thesis at King's College London. You mentioned that you took Thomas Ridd's master's cybersecurity course, and his writings inspired your research direction. In recent years, he looked at cyber warfare in his 2013 book, Cyber War Will Not Take Place. He later assessed deception operations in his classic 2020 book, Active Measures, The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare. That leads us to your research and book. You knew that you wanted to understand and define cyber warfare and intangible warfare. What do each of these terms mean, and why was it so useful for you to define these terms as a foundation for your book?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I will say, in true webinar fashion, I will start with a an apology that I am nursing one of my daughter's many colds. So if you hear me coughing, I'm sorry in advance. So the story behind this is actually quite a personal one. When I took Professor Ridd's class in 2012, I thought of cybersecurity from a war studies perspective to be something that I felt personally connected to, because in my own professional background in the Israeli military, I dealt with this. We didn't actually call it cyber back then, but it was certainly a principal defining factor for us on the intelligence side. And I was curious to see how that manifests in academia. And the first thing that I saw through that class, and it was an amazing class that we approached through a very critical outlook, was just noise. There was a lot of noise. What I immediately clocked through a combination of my own personal experience and the academic perspective layered on top of it was that with the rise of networking everything to everything and the significance of that to different portions of our lives in and out of conflict, that we really just scrambled to define what cyber warfare means in the absence of any actual instances of it happening around us, at least in a way that we can acknowledge and discuss in whatever circles that we were in. So that resulted in an extension of existing frameworks and perspectives, trying to often awkwardly shoehorn them into existing ways of thinking, whether that's through, the nuclear deterrence thinking, whether that's through the lens of influence operations, whether that's through any number of offensive outlooks that we had, and really none of that fit. So when I tackled that through my Ph.D. thesis that started in 2014 and ended in 2018 before it gradually became into the book, I wanted to deconstruct specifically how practically would warfare look like through the lens of offensive cyber capabilities. So one of the first things that I wanted to do was denoise a lot of that space as far as that conversation was concerned, because we have seen that term get stretched in so many directions, right? We've seen it morph from information operations, which also includes more subtle influence campaigns to shift perceptions. We've seen that overlap in some instances with just cyber espionage, really acts of classic espionage carry through networks, but that really have no offensive component to them. So when I decided to tackle cyber warfare as a concept, I wanted to look at it distinctly, but also recognize that it did not just pop out of the ether. It is built off of a legacy of a lot of previous work and expertise that naturally evolved into what we see cyber warfare is today. So when defining this, I first looked at it as offensive cyber operations within the context of conflict, and specifically indexing on using networks and devices to carry direct effects on other such means, rather than any secondhand nature influence campaigns or anything of the sort. I also wanted to decouple this from anything that had no actual effect, like espionage, because the way that you would respond to this, and actually the way that these things are carried out, is distinct. And it's important to make that distinction both in equities and planning, and how we think about this as military planners, as operators, as doctrine developers. Really, it's pertinent all around. And then I wanted to connect it to the history of what got us to where we are today through different lenses, right? So there's the actual rich history of how signals intelligence led itself to the whole model of network operations and all the expertise around cryptography, operational doctrine, and really the means to move through networks to gain access to information and to understand the network environment that you're in. But that's not the only thing that impacted that world. We also see significant learnings from the electronic warfare component piece of it, right? Trying to impact devices to deceive them, and also to alter situational awareness and reduce the availability of systems, platforms, networks in areas as part of conflict. So really seeing them as completely distinct is a false equivalency, and we wanted to make sure that we capture that in a way that brings it all together. So intangible warfare really relates to those elements of warfare that draw from those disciplines and that cover cyber operations, electronic warfare, and that full spectrum of offensive activities.
It sounds like you widened the aperture in order to gather the historical insights and the related technologies, and then immediately filtered it down to get to the relevant military-related cyber activities for your book. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. It's widening it in some parts and attenuating it in others to make sure that we're looking at the right thing. We're including everything that it needs to, but nothing that shouldn't be a part of it. And I recognize that there are disparate ways of looking at this, and one can be more legitimate than the other, and that's fine. I don't think as folks in the military space that we ever really reach consensus on everything, on anything, really. I think the definition of terrorism comes to mind as something that's still very hotly debated. But I thought it would lend clarity specifically to the folks who engage in these types of activities from either side on the military component of it, just looking at that from that lens.
I'm sure from the perspective of those folks who do look at the military side, this transition will be very helpful. Let's dive right into the 4 countries that you examined in depth: Russia, China, Iran, and the United States. To understand how these 4 countries plan and execute activities in cyberspace, you start with some of the earliest known cyber operations, such as Moonlight Maze. Believed to have started around 1996, the United States started investigating it around 1999 and later attributed the operations to Russia. Beyond these extensive case studies, you covered and compared historical activities on each country's doctrine, plans, statements, and available documents, so a wide range of sources. By comparing and contrasting these varied data points, you validated strategies and patterns for each of the countries you studied. You also found, though, in some cases, contradictions, or at least inconclusive observations, when a specific individual activity didn't seem to fit into the overall context. When the outliers didn't support your overall conclusions, you weren't afraid to say so. And that leads us to Russia. Your takeaway for Russia in the book is Russia has thoroughly integrated offensive cyber operations into a broader spectrum of information operations, but often fails to achieve objectives. You gave Russia credit for superlative coverage while saddling Russia with having gained a limited advantage from its extensive use of offensive cyber operations. At the same time, you set the stage for the possibility that Russia could achieve more significant results if they had what you referred to as a more thoughtful approach. If you were a teacher, it sounds to me like you're giving Russia an A- for effort, an A for potential, and a C+ overall. If Russia has completed so many repetitions in cyberspace, in some cases in support of combat operations, why the low marks for achieving their objectives?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I will say that I wrote this before the invasion of Ukraine. So obviously, that was an interesting test of some of that theory. It actually completely aligned with that. And I'll discuss how that manifested through the Ukrainian conflict. But Russia has, as said, integrated a lot of these capabilities into its planning, into its doctrine, and into its fundamental approach for offensive activities. And it is not just for the sake of achieving objectives. It also relies on offensive cyber as a means to singularly pursue and shape the environment around it. It is incredibly aggressive in doing so. And one of the things that is true for Russia and true for really all of the countries that I'll discuss is that you see a reverberation of their military and offensive culture within the cyber, right? They are not decoupled. And this is, I think, one of the interesting findings, that the culture of security operations within that respective country has reverberations that go into cyber. So when we're looking at Russia, we see a lot of aggressive activity and a willingness to absorb suboptimal outcomes as long as you have some outcome, right? They want to see the outputs of their operations go, and they're willing to absorb a lot of, let's call it less than optimal results as an outcome. By doing that, though, and especially for cyber, they actually preclude many of their own significant successes. And for the vast majority of operations that they have attempted to execute over the last 10 to 15 years, you see this. They were either blown prematurely, they executed but did not fully hit the mark, or they did what it was supposed to say on the tin, but then they immediately compromised that by, let's say, not going the whole yard in blocking attribution, for example, or precluding the assessment of their ops. So we see exactly the same thing happen with Ukraine. You see a lot of technical brilliance in their ability to execute, but at the same time, you see a lot of operational sloppiness that indicates to me a lack of thoughtfulness in approaching how they carry out individual objectives, and more importantly, how those individual objectives weave into the grand narrative of what they're trying to achieve. There's a whole mess of conversations in the security space, and especially for those of us who research cyber operations, on whether, Russia showed up for the cyber game in their invasion of Ukraine. And my answer to that is they did pretty much what I expected them to do, which is they did a lot of things, and some of them had an effect, but the way in which it all comes together is noisy and suboptimal, and definitely below what they could have done had they added a couple of other layers of intentionality. So we had a very large and ostensibly successful, though it's hard to know to which degree, operation against the satellite operator in the early days of the war, which had some kind of effect on communication networks used by the Ukrainian military, but that had an initial but limited effect, and then also cascaded well beyond its boundaries to impact all of the European customers of that particular operator, right? Now, you might say, well, the Russians don't care, but still, by any objective means, when you carry out an operation, you want it to do what it's intended to do, no more and no less, because otherwise it presents you with uncontrolled circumstances. And in cyber operations, where uncontrolled circumstances can be quite dangerous for the risk of further escalation, to me, that reads like sloppiness on the tin. So between that and everything that we've seen afterwards, which were a series of other operations, engagements, intrusions, wipers, all that, it is reflective of their potential to execute consistently and at scale, and with some high level of technical sophistication, but their ability to have it all uniquely come together as part of holistic operations, that's where they start to falter. And to tie it all back together, this is, again, exactly what we see really in every single dimension of their operational tradecraft, right? This is not unique to cyber. The entire way in which this military campaign has been executed is riddled with these, let's call it operational issues, both in planning and execution, in joint arms. All of that is really indicative of the fact that we shouldn't look at cyber in isolation. It is very much a part of how forces are being pressured to execute now, to show results. So often they throw whatever capacities they have at the enemy, even if it results in just minimal effects, but they do learn and they do evolve over time, but at the cost of burning everything that they have and having to reconstitute it, right? So really, there is that wasteful culture of exercising capabilities similar to how they do this in the more conventional spaces. So as said, a lot of potential, a lot of expertise, both on the operational side and on the technical side, but it is often the last mile of how it comes together, which it falls apart in.
It's great to hear that even with a cutoff to publish a book, that you're able to extend the framework and the thoughts to more recent activities regarding Russia and Ukraine, that the model fits, that it's all relevant. I did want to dive a little bit deeper into the no more, no less comment regarding Russia. And I'd say it's hard not to look at any Russian cyber activities in the past few years without talking about NotPetya. In 2017, Russia executed what was arguably the most damaging cyber attack in history, with some estimates topping $10 billion. The company's hit, unfortunately, included a who's who of corporate leaders: Maersk in shipping, FedEx in logistics, Merck in pharmaceuticals, and then countless smaller entities, even hospitals. Based on the global impact, NotPetya even reshaped the cyber insurance market for years to come. You wouldn't initially realize that Russia intended this malware to target just Ukraine, apparently. What do you derive from Russia's execution of NotPetya, part of a long-term cyber campaign by Russian intelligence? How did NotPetya fit or not fit into your assessment of Russian cyber strategy? And did your assessment change in light of the eventual Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, so it is NotPetya is a particularly interesting case because it is clear that it was intended to operate within a geopolitical context, right? It was initially an intrusion against a Ukrainian tax software and was intended to go after those subset, and it wildly broke out of its confines and wreaked havoc across a whole mess of networks. And it was certainly the loudest instance of this happening, but it's actually quite representative of other instances where a lack of operational care results in an uncontrollable cascade of effects that in the end is detrimental to the overall strategic posture of Russia in regards to that situation. It was true when they did NotPetya. It was true in the at least 3 different attacks that they had attempted and executed against the Ukrainian energy grid that caused significant more attention to be dedicated to that space, also learning from the defensive side. And it was even true back in 07, 08, when they initially allegedly carried attacks in Georgia and Estonia, which really was one of the first things that coalesced a cyber defensive posture for NATO, right? Something that might have not been prompted for many more years to come, certainly with not that sense of urgency. And we, as a result of how loud and aggressive and dangerous some of their attacks were, despite the fact that they have yielded limited objective value to their posture, it resulted in quite a good deal of defensive preparation from the Ukrainian side, right? We see a lot of allied support to Ukrainian defenders. We see a lot of industry support and just public support around marshaling whatever you can marshal for cyber defense posture of Ukraine. It is difficult to know how much was discovered ahead of the conflict and how much was simply prevented through defensive measures, but really it did not improve on their free reign to operate within that space, the fact that they had executed so aggressively up to that point. And if they were more cautious and judicious in expending their capabilities, they might have found an enemy less prepared to deal with the full spectrum of what they had to offer. So really, they have denied themselves a part of the advantage, even if they have still successfully executed on some of their operations and objectives. So I definitely see this as an odd learning arc on the Russian side, where yes, they continue to adapt, they continue to employ these capabilities, but really the fact that they use their own adversaries as the testing ground is a dangerous play for cybersecurity.
It appears definitely that there's just some lessons learned for Russia that have persisted over a number of years, and that just has not changed yet, and we'll see if it does change, if it's so built in, or if there's something that could improve or change based on those types of observations. I do want to switch gears a little bit and take a question from one of our participants, and after that we'll go on to your observations on China. And the question is from Katie Davis. Could you explain the drawbacks you see in the US decision to make cyber its own domain?
Yeah, so I talk about this briefly in the book, but one of the advantages and disadvantages of the US when it comes to cyber is how much resources it throws against the problem, but then really one of the things that we consistently see in US doctrine and approach is really trying to fit things into a box. And doing that is often a limiting factor, because unlike some of the more conventional domains where there's interoperability and there's multi-domain operations, cyber is everything and everywhere at once. It's all the networks that permeate the various elements of DoD. It's all the networks that permeate your adversaries across the different domains, right? So you see this in the really weird, and I do love me a good DoD chart, but you see this in some of the weird DoD charts that's come up in some of the early doctrinal documents, where you see cyber kind of like permeating through all the other domains, but it's also its own domain. So I think trying to be overly rigid in defining cyber might actually be a limiting factor, whereas obviously the Russians have their own disadvantages, but the fact that they view information as the key medium, as something that's more encompassing, that has various offensive and defensive components to it, is probably the more realistic representation of that space. And I know that's something that the US kind of flows in and out of depending on who you ask and at what point in time. Is it information warfare? Is it cyber warfare? Is it the information space, the cyber space, and all that? But I think trying to put, in particular, cyber into a rigid box is probably not conducive to its long-term deep integration into every single space, every single branch, and every single type of operation, defensive or offensive.
It's helpful to have that perspective based on your studies, and we'll definitely get back to some of the observations regarding the United States later. I wanted to move on to China at this point. Your bottom line for China went in a completely different direction compared to Russia's extensive practical experience. You credit China for its doctrinally mature approach to conduct cyber operations in support of the military. This sounds promising until you add that China lacks crucial operational experience. That's either a qualified compliment or the type of criticism you never want to hear in the military, being better at doctrine than in the field. Over many years, China demonstrated its competency in cyberspace, notably high-profile intrusions against American defense contractors, technology firms, government agencies. There is no lack of case studies to research, yet they're almost all nearly related to national security or economic espionage, not cyber effects supporting military objectives. What are the key observables that enabled you to assess China overall? What should military planners conclude regarding China's capability to execute and integrate cyber operations?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you look at, so there's a few sources. One is we have seen a lot of Chinese network intrusion operations over the years. You see them evolve. You see them being very intentional. You see them going very deep into a truly strategic mindset of how cyber plays into their national objectives. So the fact that they effectively pursue economic objectives alongside national security components, that to me indicates that they're able to effectively utilize these capabilities in service of a broader agenda rather effectively. You also see them harnessing their own quote unquote private sector more effectively than many of the other actors that we see out there. So for example, how they managed to successfully capture the internal market for developing exploits for software vulnerabilities is something that can obviously feed the process within the Chinese cyber operations ecosystem. So you see a lot of intentionality in the execution, and the quality of their operations is quite high. Though perhaps not the highest, but quite high, enough to achieve objectives. And you see that reflected in the gradual evolution of their doctrinal and strategic thinking. So in the literature that they bring to bear, you see an increasing recognition of the growing role that networks play in enabling modern warfare. So obviously this is commensurate to observations of how both coalitions, but also principally the US fights in its various wars, and its increasing dependency on a multitude of networks, both military or civilian, in order to effectively operate in complex environments. So they realize that whatever equipment streams in their direction in whatever military scenario they encounter is likely going to be backed by a whole mess of information streams and interconnectedness. And if they are able to disrupt that effectively, cohesively, they can actually generate some meaningful effects. So that is something that they realize, and the way that it fits into the Taiwan contingency, which I cover at length in the book, is again highly suggestive, because what you see from how they realize the space is that there is obviously carrying out an amphibious invasion is one of the most difficult campaigns that you can do, and especially considering you have an adversary that has done nothing but prepare for this for the last many decades. Obviously, this is going to be uphill, and you see a unique dedication from the Chinese military to really throw a lot of resources at potentially making this happen. So if they're able to delay the participation of US forces even by a few days, even just inducing that type of latency in a response, that can have strategic consequences for how that initial phase of the invasion carries out, right? Because if forces are able to respond and rebuff those early stages, that can significantly complicate anything that they're planning next. Whereas if they introduce a loss of faith in US-based systems in the region and are able to delay both the US and its allies from intervening, that can really buy them some incredibly meaningful time where fog of war enables additional action. So they get it. They truly do get it. And that's meaningful. They have learned from the mistakes of others, which is important as well. Even if they do not participate in a great amount of international conflict, they have certainly applied lessons from it, and they try to adapt. But it is difficult to replace the benefits of experience. And simply put, much like in other military dimensions, they do not have the experience, and drills can only take you so far. So in the absence of consistently executing on joint operations that have a cyber component to them, it is difficult to know how well they will actually do this. And because they do not have extensive experience in carrying out offensive operations and learning from what works and what doesn't, they are basically, it is mostly quote unquote dry runs in the meantime. So I think they have a lot of potential, but they are the biggest question mark as far as I'm concerned, because it really is unclear how they will show up if and when the day comes. I am certain that they're preparing capabilities, and I'm certain they will be able to achieve some effects, but are they actually going to successfully deliver on the interplay for joint operations to really make either strategic or meaningful tactical effects through their offensive cyber operations? That kind of remains to be seen. Hence the question mark around that.
You focused on the concept of a 1 or 2 or 3 day delay in terms of United States and others slowing down China's invasion, or China being able to speed it up, and how both sides are very focused on the concept of the delay or not having a delay. And I wanted to go into China just a little bit more with that thought that you'd noted that China's got their strategic support force created in 2015, created to maintain local advantages in the aerospace, space, cyber, and electromagnetic fields, while also providing attack and defense in cyber and electromagnetic spaces. With Taiwan's aging military platforms, you believe that China has had ample opportunity to seek vulnerabilities in some of these systems, yet Taiwan's leadership similarly has had time to invest in redundant systems given the possibility of a Chinese attack. China must also consider that the US and allies promised to defend Taiwan. There simply aren't recent Chinese military campaigns or even cyber effects operations on which to refine your assessment. How do you combine what you know about Chinese doctrine and cyber activities with zero recent historical examples of large-scale combat operations, even before considering how cyber might be integrated? How clearly can you assess China's potential integrated cyber operations with enough confidence to be useful to military planners?
I think we need to prepare for various contingencies. It is the art of the possible, and then we assess with varying likelihoods what can be, right? So there are some levels of offensive operations that can be fairly trivially executed, even by a relatively low-level adversary. Like disrupting civilian networks is something that I would expect the Chinese to do and to succeed at. There are other such capacities that would be more difficult to execute at, such as disrupting critical infrastructure that services the region, but also US and allied forces, like some of these satellite operators. I think that's entirely possible, considering the vulnerabilities of those spaces. And then there's, of course, actually interfering with military networks and assets. And to that, I combine a perspective on how intentional and successful the Chinese have been in developing network operations in general. And then I wanted to look at some of the inherent vulnerabilities of the equipment and networks that would be brought to bear in that space. So I did quite a lot of research into US military networks and computing power that's brought to bear in those, and how different types of military hardware interconnects. And the view of it, to be honest, is a little grim, because if you look at this is a lot of aging communication protocols that are sometimes 50 years old that need to be legacy in order to interconnect. In some cases, you just see completely redundant communication protocols that were connected for the sake of connectivity. And in other instances, even in newer platforms that operate in the region, you see through assessment reports just how vulnerable they are. I did a talk about this in a different conference that should be available as well, just on the state of vulnerability of these pieces of hardware. And if you look, for example, at the F-35, sort of a flagship project that also introduced a lot of computing and networking power as part of the highlights of that combat platform, but it is also incredibly vulnerable by the own assessment of Government Accountability Office research. And that's just the things that they found. And they are consistently under-addressed. And these are both vulnerabilities in the equipment itself and the software that runs on it, but also in the networks that service the entire fleet of planes. So in many instances, the GAO classified some of those pieces of hardware as unsurvivable in combat operations, which means that they do not expect an F-35 that goes in to necessarily come out strictly because its software is vulnerable. So whether or not the Chinese will be able to exploit that obviously remains to be seen, and I hope we won't see it. But if you couple their intentionality, their technical and operational skills with the sheer amount of vulnerabilities, both tactical and strategic in that space, it is a little worrying that there is potential there. Hard to see how it pans out, but I think definitely the need for contingencies to absorb the likelihood of this happening and to prepare countermeasures for that.
We have numerous questions from the audience. There's one that's just spot on regarding your discussion right now on weapon systems. And this is from Caleb. When it comes to offensive cyber operations conducted against operational weapon systems, much of the thinking by security professionals tend to view them as though through the lens of how you attack enterprise networks over the internet. Operational weapon systems aren't on the internet in the same kind of way, so that makes the concept of access and persistence much different. His question is, what does gaining access and maintaining persistence on operational weapon systems networks look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer to that is a little too long to tackle fully here, but I'll say, and this is the distinction that I make in the book, not everything needs to have persistence. And the notion of what I call event-based operations, it touches exactly on this. It is essentially through an evolution of electronic warfare that has a data component to it, you might be able to achieve a cyber effect on a weapons platform or a radar or really any kind of let's say, something that's primed to receive external communications simply through exploiting its existing protocols. So you might not need to have presence within the networks in order to achieve some kind of limited effect, and that might be enough. That said, it's not like enterprise networks, absolutely, but these things are networked, and sometimes there are overlapping meshes of networks, whereas if you are particularly judicious about how you run a long game, you could potentially start with an entry into a lower classified network and find yourself kind of hopping between them. Or if you have a person in the right place, you can potentially introduce something, or if you intervene with the hardware supply chain, you can potentially introduce a component piece. So really, in the initial leg that we're describing here of how to achieve access and persistence and presence in these networks is not outside the realm of possibility. It might be slightly more difficult than it would be for your conventional enterprise network, but considering the vast amount of people that deal with these networks, how they're interconnected to one another, and how they often rely on various civilians, interlocutors, and also just overlap with civilian networks, it is conceivable that you would be able to do something to gain access and achieve effects. It requires a different order of skill, but that's the same for some of the attacks that we've seen on critical infrastructure, right? IT versus OT networks, where you see a hop from one to the other. There are often these chinks in the armor that allow you potential access to such sensitive networks. So it is possible, just requires a bit of creativity and investment and will.
Well, it's amazing that we got a good transition there from your answer to a participant question right into Iran. It's a bit unexpected but appropriate that you mention Iran as the nation with power projection through cyber. You assert that Iran engages in offensive cyber operations as a means to project power below the threshold of warfare. And then you support your argument with many examples to present a vivid picture of Iran's capabilities, strategy, and experience in cyberspace. What struck me as most memorable in the book was what you said, where the US codified military domainhood of cyber, Iran views it as a tool within a broader asymmetric arsenal. Iran has years of practical experience with imposing costs, damage, and violence against adversaries, large and small, using decentralized operations, often leveraging proxy forces. For Iran, success comes from doing damage, not aspiring to be a top-tier cyber operator. You provide an abundance of historical case studies to support the argument. How do you weigh what appears to be numerous Iranian successes in cyberspace with Iran's relatively modest objectives to deterring or damaging its adversaries? How advanced are their capabilities if most of their activities have been using standalone cyber to create effects against one or more targets?
Yeah, so I really like the Iranian case, and I added it specifically for the book. It wasn't present in my PhD thesis because I thought it was so unique and interesting and valuable. Because it is also a reflection of their security posture, whereas they make the most out of what they have, just in order to create an effect and to project the notion that they exist and that they can reach out and touch their adversaries, so to speak, which is often enough when you do so consistently to convey at least some form of, I wouldn't even say deterrent, but punching above your weight. And this is exactly what characterizes the Iranian forces in general, but through this as well, they make really good uses of what is at their disposal to punch above their weight. So their tools are often shoddy. They are loud. They frequently get caught, sometimes in very embarrassing ways. But at the end of the day, if you look at their offensive operations, they have consistently managed to get effects against their adversaries, including in instances of critical infrastructure in some respects. So they have definitely punched above their weight, right? They are a notable threat actor, and I would never classify them as top tier as far as their capability goes, but they have incorporated offensive cyber activities into their broader approach for projecting power against its enemies in the region and beyond, and they will continue to do so. So in my mind, they realize to some extent what they have, and they use it to the extent that they can. They don't overreach necessarily, and as a result, they get effects. And that's something. That's not nothing. If you know that you are not going to single-handedly, bring down the Israeli military through a cyber attack, not that anybody could do this to any military, but they realize that this is not going to turn the tide of conflict, but they still try to make noise. And even if they failed to poison the water supplies in Israel, they tried, and they were weirdly close to succeeding. And the same with the attack on various Saudi networks, right? I mean, they managed to get an effect. They managed to put themselves in the headlines. That's not nothing. And considering it is almost like applying offensive cyber capabilities to their notion of projecting terror, right? It is just in lockstep with their agenda. And I don't know how much intentionality there is at the top level decision making, but what is clear to me is that it appears to be cohesive with the rest of what they're trying to achieve through proxy forces, through projecting threats, through reaching beyond their borders with whatever they have at their disposal. So it is an odd case because of the relatively lower quality of their ops, but you also see this internally. They managed to harness because they don't have that many people on the inside, they harness commercial companies, they harness freelancers, they harness the hacking communities that they have within Iran. Like, they really just took everything that they could and threw it against the problem and managed to get some effects. So it's not bad.
Iran definitely plays it as a team sport. And you said that just like with their terrorist activities, the use of proxies and other agents is just a critical part of it. What I'm wondering, though, is that when you do sophisticated integration of cyber into military operations, it's often thought that you need extensive planning and close control of the supporting elements. Given the Iranian use of proxies, what progress do you expect to see from Iran with its cyber capabilities? Will Iran need to develop organic cyber capabilities under its direct control, or do you think that Iran's reliance on its proxies can continue as business as usual?
I assume they will try. To the degree to which they're successful remains to be seen, but I don't necessarily think that this will be their greatest strength. I think their strength lies in the loosely coupled asymmetric nature of the resources that they bring to bear, right? So, for example, when it comes to a potential conflict with Israel, which as an Israeli is near and dear to my heart, the biggest threat that we see in an Iranian context is not Iran, it's Hezbollah. So the same thing applies, and I don't necessarily know how tightly coupled they will receive instructions from their Iranian representatives, but it doesn't necessarily matter that much. The fact that they're deploying capabilities that close to home with significant strategic reserve is meaningful by itself. So I don't know how much they're going to be able to organically develop this, but in the absence of a direct conventional conflict with Iran, which will really only happen if, realistically, if somebody invades Iran or conducts a major campaign within Iran or against Iran, I don't necessarily think it matters that much, because a lot of the conflict that they wage is beyond their conventional borders anyway. And I do think that the fact that their cyber component elements are loosely coupled is also a weakness, because they cannot convey operational culture. They cannot directly control. Like, we've seen a lot of the people who ostensibly work on their objectives to also moonlight and do other things. And that presents a risk, right? So there are bad, or let's say less favorable components to the fact, but it is what it is. And it's hard to say how that will translate to capabilities directly under their control.
Iran gives us some good compare and contrast examples in terms of how they do it. I wanted to switch to another question from one of our participants, from Clint Davis. What are a few things Ukraine could do better in terms of cyber operations?
That's a good question. I guess it depends if we're talking about defensively or offensively. I don't particularly think that offensive cyber operations is at the top of their list at the moment. There is such a degree of fragmentation and chaos among the Russian forces that it is probably not going to have a significant effect. I do think that considering the fact that this conflict, this war, this invasion is likely to be protracted, that they should expect the Russians to be marshaling additional strategic capabilities, right? Because they've expended something at the outset of the war, and then they've resorted to more tactical, low-yield wiper attacks. But in the meantime, so much time has passed that they're likely redeveloping capabilities and access to carry out more strategic operations. At least that's what I would do. So assuming that, they need to prepare for those contingencies, right? What happens, for example, if Starlink, which is, at least by reporting, is a significant part of their strategic comms and military coordination, what happens if that winks out? What happens if their strategic comms are impacted by an offensive cyber capacity? They need to be able to absorb and prepare for that and have contingencies in place and redundancies to the degree that it's possible in order to absorb future potential attacks. Essentially identify vulnerable component pieces of what their network-centric warfare would be, if I use 1990 era US military terms, so that they can essentially define their centers of gravity and defend them. I also think that there were efforts to better prepare the Ukrainians for what was to come. In a lot of those countries, they, for example, rely on old versions of Windows and unpatched software, which is probably vulnerable in 18 different ways. So if we're talking about critical infrastructure, for example, mobile network operators, any actual ICS component pieces, I would definitely prioritize updating those to the degree that it's possible and introducing resiliency there, because they might be targeted. Probably through conventional means, but you never know.
Thank you for the blast to the past on network-centric warfare. That definitely hits a note there. Let's talk about the United States for a few minutes. Before summarizing your assessment of United States cyber operations, I'd like to mention the intense title of that chapter. American cyber superiority. For your overall assessment, you describe the United States as technologically best positioned to conduct offensive cyber operations, but a rigid approach to cyber as a domain slows effective integration. That sounds comparable to saying the United States is its own worst enemy when it comes to cyber. You question the United States' path to designate cyber as a separate domain and the corresponding establishment of Cyber Command. You believe that cyber is an inseparable facet of all domains. You further highlight what is described as cascading doctrine and strategy at the national level, integrated military doctrine, and service-specific strategy and doctrine. The United States differentiates cyber, electronic warfare, and various information-related capabilities. In other words, you identify a lot of lanes, lines, and buckets, while acknowledging that the United States military and service branches have made great strides to break down these barriers. What intrinsic benefits exist regarding how the United States military approaches cyber, for example, by designating cyber as a domain? How do the superior capabilities continue to exist despite doctrinal and organizational challenges?
I think there's the U.S. is a fascinating case. I still think, despite all of the challenges that I mentioned, it is probably the best position to both carry out the most impactful offensive cyber operations on an overall scale, and also to integrate those for joint operations at both a tactical and a theater level. The problem is, as I implied, is that the integration is slow and painful and mired in essentially a massive bureaucracy of relationships and interconnectedness and equities and who owns what and how you use it. Because at the heart of cyber capabilities, you have, and this is where the distinction between my two modes comes into play. I look at event-based capabilities, which essentially you could potentially couple to a weapons platform. It should be robust. You could put that on an F-35 and send it to do a tactical effect somewhere, or potentially use an infantry team to do that in the field. Or you have strategic capabilities that rely on extensive, long-term developed network access that you can use to achieve effects, right? So those rely on equities. They rely on research into vulnerabilities. They require developed access into sensitive networks. It is clear that the center of expertise for that rests not necessarily with Cyber Command, but with the NSA. So I understand the gradual graduation of this, but rather than looking at this as a distinct domain, I think what we need is a strategic hub for capability development and integration that then projects capacities out, rather than trying to shoehorn it into the structure of a domain, which then every single service that I've seen in their respective doctrines tries to escape in some weird creative gymnastics. So, some services apply this to tactical capabilities. Others look at more of a defensive structure. But really, there's a lot of services rediscovering the same issues and mistakes and challenges rather than having it be approached cohesively. So I'm simply not 100% convinced that Cyber Command solves for some of the biggest problems of integration. But despite all of that, and despite all the challenges, I still think that if one of the maybe 3 top players that I expect to use these capabilities is the United States, and use it well. And we've seen some of that, especially in the conflict with ISIS. So, So I do think that there is a lot of progressive thought on this. I am positive that some of the technological capabilities being developed are highly significant, and that there is an operational reserve of capacities that is likely to be meaningful to a variety of adversaries. But there are still limitations that limit the actualization of the full potential of what can be brought to bear.
Let's take those thoughts against one specific historical example. In the case of Joint Task Force Ares, the United States acknowledged that starting in 2016, Joint Task Force Ares planned missions under Operation Glowing Symphony to counter the Islamic State's presence in cyberspace. This appears to be an example of using cyber operations against an adversary while conducting military operations such as kinetic strikes. there aren't a lot of known examples of nations using cyber and kinetic strikes in a coordinated manner. How much weight do you place on the planning and execution value of this experience? How does this experience translate into a sustainable advantage for the United States and those observing these activities, such as Russia?
I think Logan Symphony is a great example because what it shows is the desire to test these operational concepts in actual conflict. Now, granted, this will look differently depending on who the adversary is, and ISIS is certainly not China or even Iran. The equipment that you will see is different, the networks are different, and the capacities to penetrate them is different. But really, the most important part is not the software vulnerabilities that you bring to bear, it's aligning these forces with one another towards a shared purpose, right? So if you are disrupting the communication capacities of an ISIS force before you send in conventional or soft, I mean, that to me says we know what we have and we know how to employ it, and that's a good signal. And even if it wasn't optimal, even if it was a part of it was expeditionary or exploratory, that's fine. I think that still shows relatively advanced thinking in integration. The question is, how idiosyncratic is it? How much of it was really unique to that particular task force, and how scalable is that if they were trying to apply this at a broader theater level, even in a more meaningful campaign against a serious adversary? How much are they able to draw in equities that are harder to take from more sensitive intelligence assets and bring those to bear, right? So there are still unanswered questions, but I think the friction that you achieve through something like JTF Ares and Glowing Symphony is a good indication that they're kind of going down the integrative route and are intent to actually see this in action beyond just words on paper.
On the topic of the United States, we've got a question from one of our participants, and I think this will be our last question. It really integrates a lot of what you've talked about, and I think it ties things together. Jamie A. asks if you could compare and contrast Iranian low investment and cost cyber operations with tangible outcomes compared to United States with high investment, high overhead cyber operations with arguably little outcomes. Is this a factor that's because of authorities or planning or policy? Kind of what contributes to this?
So it really depends. There are different classes of outcomes, right? There is, I am trying to simply create a visible effect in order to project my presence. This is something that the US rarely needs to do because it does not need to establish itself as a credible adversary. I think that's hard to miss. So the objectives are different for the Iranians and for the US. Really, what the US looks for is something that complements its capacity to achieve objectives in unison, right? So the notion that we need to preserve equities and that we need to operate in unison, I also think that the United States and its allies cares a lot more about preventing collateral damage than anybody else would. So if you're operating in a civilian rich environment, that introduces considerations that the Iranians simply do not have, considering they were trying to poison water supplies. So all that lends itself to a different set of trade-offs. And I understand why the US would be more cautious and judicious in how it develops and deploys capabilities. It might be a little bit to its detriment in some cases, but the overall approach I understand. It's just a question of not going too much to the extreme. When some US malware was discovered a few years ago, some of the statements were that it looks like it was written with a lot of lawyers in the room. Like it actually reads that way. And I can see that. And it doesn't necessarily prevent all the issues, but it does help you keep cyber capabilities in their respective lanes, which is, I think, healthy to some degree. So it is really a question about moderation. The best combo is probably somewhere in the middle.
That question definitely helped tie together a lot of things. And I know even with this hour, we barely scratched the surface of what's in your book. So I'd highly suggest that folks grab a copy of the book because there is so much in it that goes into some deeper analysis into these examples. Plus there's the framework and the parameters that look at what is considered a cyber warfare and the other terms that you defined. And I'd like to conclude with, thank you, Dr. Moore, for sharing your insights in your book and spending an hour with JSOU to share the highlights of your research. On behalf of Joint Special Operations University and the United States Special Operations Command, we appreciate this chance to enhance our understanding of cyber warfare and intangible warfare.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.